This happened to me during Christmas in 2019. I live in a capital city, and the last train from the city center to the suburb where I live departs around late at night, a few days before Christmas. I arranged to meet with my friends from university to celebrate the holidays and to say goodbye for the winter break. One evening, I was at a small house party with my friends who rented an apartment near our campus, and it was fun. We were playing video games, putting on music, and enjoying drinks, but unfortunately, midnight was approaching, and I had to leave soon, not to miss my last train. I departed about 10 minutes past midnight. I didn't have to walk far to reach the bus station. The bus departed on time, but the ride from my friend's apartment to the train station took longer than I was expecting. Even though I advised the driver to speed up, he was going stop by stop, letting more and more people enter. It was making me a bit angry inside, and even though the last train station is a large station, there are still 15 minutes between final bus stop and the train station. I was a little worried that I might miss the last chance of getting home soon. Fortunately, about 2 minutes later, only I remain on the bus. When that happened, the driver did not stop anymore and decided to ride directly to the station. Stayed there where the point where people were waiting for a bus, and I was really grateful for that. With only a few minutes remaining until the train departure, I literally dashed out of bus and ran to the underground subway. I noticed that there was almost no people around, and the subway was completely empty. There were only one man walking in front of me, who, based on his clothing, seemed to work as a construction worker. He was wearing a jacket with reflex stripes on it, but to my surprise, he wasn't walking in a line, but swerving from side to side and stumbling from time to time. When we descended into the underground, he suddenly turned around and noticed me. He mumbled something that it was hard to make out the words, but he was telling me to stop running. I had no time for idle chit-chat. I ran past him and swerved around so that I wouldn't touch him and continue running down the stairs. Once continually running, I realized that the train just booted up. It was driving down the tracks, and the cart was just about to reach the end of the station point. I literally jumped inside the cart, right before the train was about to close the door and leave the station. I realized that I had made it, but just after a single second, I heard a loud shout coming from that worker. I turned around and saw that the worker jumped inside the cart as well. The train inside was empty. Not a single person was in any cart, and it made me a bit anxious. That worker was probably the last passenger to at least see the train leave for the night. But the worst part, it wasn't his desperate attempt to reach the train departure point. I noticed that his face was completely red, and he wasn't wearing any sort of head protection. Once he jumped into the train, he instantly fell down on the floor and stayed there for a few seconds without moving. The only thing that could be heard in that empty cart was his heavy breathing. After a few moments later, he stood up and sat directly across from me, still breathing heavily in and out. I took a small moment to inspect his face and noticed that he had a few cuts on his cheeks and chin. His clothes also seemed to be dirty and covered in dust. He noticed that I was staring at him and was just about to say something, but suddenly went quiet and closed his eyes, started to shake his head, and began to mumble to himself. The first thought that came up to my mind was that this man was probably drunk. I stopped staring at him and turned away my gaze, but the situation was only going to slowly become worse. The train was heading towards my final destination, but it still takes about 20 minutes to get there, and during that time, I had a feeling that I was being stared at. I looked around and saw that the worker was really gazing at me, and his eyes seemed to be filled out with rage. I asked him if something was wrong, but instead of answering my question, the man started to ask random questions to me back. He asked me something like if I remember him, and asking me if I wasn't living too far away from the tracks. I remember every question had almost nothing in common with each other and was completely absurd and pointless. At the end of our short and awkward conversation, the man sat back deeper into his seats and finally stopped asking more unrelated questions. There were still like 15 minutes of train ride remaining, and I had no idea what the drunk worker had in mind to do next. He stopped talking, but his eyes kept staring at me the entire way. I decided to just stare out of the window until the ride was over and ignored the man until then. A few minutes went by, and then I decided to take a quick look back at the man. I turned my head around and saw that he was not sitting in the same place anymore. He got up and was standing in the middle of the cart, but to my shock, he was holding a sharp metal object in his hands that was about the size of a construction tool screwdriver. I don't know where he was keeping it until now, but I knew that wasn't a standard screwdriver, but a metal object, and he was holding it like it was a weapon. He wasn't looking in my direction anymore, but at the other door of the cart. Then it became clear to me that he was planning to jump out of the train before the train would reach his destination point. Once I realized that, I turned my head back to face the window, but I was keeping an eye on him from the left side of my eye view. He stayed standing in that place for a few minutes before he began to walk towards the door. The train wasn't even close to the station point, and he was walking towards the door that wasn't going to open at the same time with the opposite one. Very suspicious, I began to fear that he wasn't really planning on leaving the train. He stood at the door and remained like that for a few moments before he turned his head in my direction, and once he did, he suddenly sprinted towards me. I instantly got terrified and couldn't move for a second. Only when he was already too close, I tried to stand up and run away, but the man grabbed my bag and started to struggle with me. He was trying to dig his sharp object into me, but I was holding his arm back in a desperate attempt to force it below. His power was greater than mine, and that was when I realized that the only thing that I can do is to really kick his knees with my feet as hard as I can. Inside my head, I just kept shouting to myself, "Kick, kick, 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 kick." When I finally managed to do it, the man lost most of his balance and tripped over me, allowing me to escape from his grip. It really took me a lot of strength and force to kick him, and the metal object that he was holding fell out from his hand. I instantly started to sprint to the very end of the cart. The cart's ends are actually barred with semi-plastic walls and are rarely used by passengers. I went there just to put a little distance between me and the worker, but once he recovered from my kick, the man decided to jump out of the train on the move and stopped and began to crawl his way to the doors and managed to leave the train without getting badly injured, but I don't really know what happened to him next. When I felt like an eternity, that man tried to hurt me, and it left me scared and shook for the rest of the evening. If you enjoy our stories, show some love with a subscribe and a like. It encourages us to make more. One Christmas Eve when I was 16 years old, and I had no siblings. So, as usual, most of my family was in the living room watching Christmas movies, and my cousins were playing video games upstairs in my family's family room/console room. This year, I didn't really feel so much like hanging out with my cousins. They were ages 7 to 14, and there were 4 of them. Nephews and nieces of my mom's sisters. Out of all my similar age cousins, none came home for Christmas, which was a huge disappointment. So I just made it a mission to give myself a good Christmas Eve night by enjoying the night by myself with my phone and a 6-pack of beer that my cousin AJ snuck me. It was no longer snowing by this point in the night, but it was a white Christmas with probably 2 feet of snow on the grass at the time. I wasn't too close with my immediate family. That was over my aunts, uncles, cousins. I stayed in my room on my phone for a while, and by 11, my dad knocked on the door and asked why and where I had been for most of the night, and I said I didn't really know. Otherwise, I only really interacted with my parents and aunts and uncles for dinner. After that, I just kind of broke off to do my own thing. Meanwhile, the walls around me weren't at any point quiet. There was always some kind of noises, but eventually things started to quiet. Down with everyone, most people were leaving by 11 to 12. Usually I'd join my immediate cousins to their family room to play console games with them, but once again, for whatever reason, I wasn't feeling it this year. Also, the smell of mac and cheese and ham and all that junk just lingering in the house was starting to get annoying to me, So I think shortly after my dad came to my room, I put on my boots and a jacket and snuck out the back door to go for a walk. Like I said, I had a 6-pack of beer and I was planning on bringing that to the woods diagonally across from our house. It was past curfew since I was only 16, but I was willing to take the risk. For those of you wondering where all these kids got their booze from, back then I already mentioned my cousin AJ, but before I knew him, aka my sister's boyfriend at the time, there was another older kid in town who simply had a fake ID or knew somebody who was 21, and you could just hit him up and offer him an extra $20 bill for some beers. His name was Straight Up Beer Kid. We found out Beer Kid was kind of a loser anyway. So, right across the street from us and across the grass to get to the woods, there's this little opening between the trees. It was a commonly used entry point to the woods, so there were no obstructions in that little doorway of the woods. I followed the path along until I found a tree that kept me sufficiently hidden and blended, but I could also sit down on one of the main branches. The tree was low enough to the ground where you could just climb up to get to some section to sit down, and comfortable enough where I could rest my back on the trunk. I popped open my first beer, struggling because of the gloves, and it was an expensive name drop. I only drank Bud Light, and actually at that point in my life, that might have been the only beer I ever have had to drink. I successfully finished all 6 cans, and may have accidentally dropped a can or two off the branch I was sitting on with every flashlight or set of headlights I'd see out past the trees. I was afraid it was a cop or something. Another 10 minutes later, of just sitting there and possibly falling asleep, my head perked up and I looked around everywhere because I just heard a noise. It was one relatively loud noise of a stick being broken. My mind was very scattered, clearly because of my intoxication. I immediately had to think it was some kids messing with me. Didn't occur to me that I was the one who was trespassing in the woods behind the neighborhood. I jumped off the tree and my knees basically gave in, like I lost all my strength, and I fell to the ground. I'm pretty sure I started laughing, but before I hit the ground, laughing turned into groan in pain. I realized I had possibly seen headlights flashing around somewhere out in the darkness. I was still somewhat aware to my surroundings, to some degree, I guess. But I also wasn't, because I should have seen somebody approaching, or maybe even just overlooked it. But I didn't, and all of a sudden I felt 2 hands grab my arms and yank me up off the ground until I was back on my feet. I was convinced it was a police officer. At first, there was no attempt or keywords spoken aloud by the person to inform me that they were police. I was probably too drunk to even care. I just wanted to be warm at that moment, asking if he could shine his light on me while I zip up my jacket. He made some kind of gesture with his arm and said he'd take me to his car. My phone started ringing in my pocket, and I said out loud, it was my dad. I guess he didn't like that because he let go of my arm for a second. At that point, I started to move faster through the woodsways. With slight fear, I started awkwardly jogging down the path for like 10 seconds until the guy yelled something that was to scare me because I started rushing more and more. Eventually, I finally reached the opening to the street, and right across the street was our house where I could see there were still people there. My 2 uncles were outside smoking and talking. I figured someone was still there. I really needed to act like I wasn't freaking out, so I slowed my pace down to a walk, and as I was walking towards the street, I heard footsteps very clearly approaching behind me. I felt someone grab my arm and say, "Come on," quietly. I yanked my arm away and jogged across the street. The man stayed at the other side of the road now, in better lighting from the streetlight. The man's face was apparently a lot older than I'd imagined my family was watching, so I yelled, "Please go away," so that everybody could hear. I didn't look back any more times to see what the man was doing behind me. I just walked into the house as soon as I entered. My mom's siblings looked at me in shock, embarrassed. I said some guy was following me. I urged all of them to come outside. We all went back outside together, and that man was across the street, standing at the entrance to the woods. My mom's aunts and uncles literally chased him away until he was deep enough in the woods to be out of sight. There was a conversation after all of them. The parents wanted to know why that man was following me. I told them that he was trying to rob me and that I snuck out to go to a friend's house, but on the way back, got hassled by that man. I left out the part that I was drunk and had that beer in the forest narrators. I kind of get scared whenever I see those woods across the street from our house now, which is all the time, and especially if it's dark outside now that I'm an adult. I strive to live that adult college life, which has me constantly drinking around campus, except not as reckless anymore, or maybe at least knowing how to not make a fool of myself and not get caught up. I think it's safe to say that I will never be going into those woods at night ever again. The first notable horrible thing to happen to me in my life was just after I turned 18, right around Christmas time. Me and a bunch of friends had really gotten into drinking and partying. Seems to be common for a lot of people. In their senior year of high school, I would go to a lot of parties at different houses. Sometimes I wouldn't really know who owned the house we were at, and I didn't care. There's something fun about going to a completely random house and getting drunk with a bunch of people in the backyard and crowded house. I usually was with my group of close friends, Ricky, Daniel, and Justin, but at this one party, it was just me and Ricky. I didn't even know how Ricky heard about this party. I think a friend of his told him about it or something. But basically, a bunch of kids from other high schools in the area were in attendance. It was a very heavily attended party. Ricky was there before me. I showed up alone, which maybe wasn't such a great idea because even from outside the house, I could see this party was bumping. The whole house was lit inside and music was blasting. I texted Ricky that I was there, and he said he was in the corner of the living room. There was no parking on that street, so I had to walk from some other block. When I let myself in through the side gate to the backyard, I was hit with a wave of body heat. Kids who didn't fit in the house were in the backyard. Not as many, probably like 20 kids in the backyard. I laughed and said my excuses to any couple making out or any group of kids seemingly in my way. It took my time to make it into the house. I went into the kitchen first, actually, and cracked open a beer, then made my way into the crowd. In the living room, I spotted Ricky and pushed my way over to him. He was talking to some girl, and after he introduced us, the two of them somehow seemed to be really hitting it off, like to the extent that I felt like I was him. I told Ricky I was going to go check out the rest of the house. I made my way upstairs and discovered people were actually up there, probably against the homeowners. Wishes the hallway upstairs wasn't that crowded. Maybe 6 or 7 people hanging out on one side of the hallway by some bedrooms, and 2 people on the other side were standing by the door to another bedroom. I asked them if there was a bathroom up here, and they pointed me to a door. It was probably the actual bedroom of the kids whose house this was. It had a bathroom, definitely only meant for one person to use at a time. So I guess I skipped a line. I found myself using some skin products on the bathroom counter, but there was decent reason for it. At the time, my face had been visibly red and blotchy from out of control acne, and I felt like I needed some moisturizer, so I was applying some random creams in the bathroom. Then I heard the door open. Someone who hadn't been upstairs walked into the room, and I knew he had no business going in the bedroom. I opened the bathroom door slightly, asking, "What are you doing?" And he replied right back at me, asking, "What are you doing?" I said, "Sorry, there's a lot of noise out there. I couldn't really hear you come in." He said he was looking for the bathroom. I said, "There's one more downstairs." Then I looked over the bathroom counter to see if there was a toothbrush before fully getting up from the toilet to find one. I gave him a perplexed look for a second, then handed him a random toothbrush I found, because I thought maybe he was trying to brush the taste of alcohol off his breath when he took the toothbrush without even saying thank you. I left the room feeling very strange about him. I stormed down the hall and back downstairs. It was incredibly hot upstairs. It was a little less hot downstairs. The bedroom had been ice cold, which was probably why it felt better downstairs. Ricky was still with that girl. I didn't want to intrude. Ricky was going to bang at some point tonight, and that meant I needed to find someone to keep myself entertained. Going to a county public high school, as decently thick as I was, definitely helped. My prospects of meeting girls at these parties, I made my way back to the kitchen. There were 3 girls sitting at the kitchen counter who I hadn't seen earlier, so I leaned over them from behind and tried to start a conversation. They knew I was drunk, and they were kind of too, and they weren't being really that friendly to me. One of the other girls' boyfriends came over and said something to me that led me to backing off before I could finish my drink. Ricky texted me saying instead of us leaving and driving him and that girl, or would be dipping in her car instead. So I was going to basically take Ricky's car and leave without him. He was lucky I was only a little tipsy and not totally wasted for some reason. I had a very high tolerance when it came to drinking. Really, my night should have been over. I went back to Ricky's car and started driving back to his house. But when I saw a bumping party as I was passing, I hit the brake, then looked in my rearview mirror. I stupidly decided, yes, I was doing this. I don't know what got into me. I parked on the nearest side street again and ran back over to the house. No one I knew was there. I knew nobody in the house. I talked to some kids in the backyard. I led by saying I'd went to the high school that they went to, hoping they wouldn't call my lie. But one of them did, asking what year the 4 of them started to laugh. When I said 2020, they obviously could smell my lie. So I walked away. That was stupid. I don't know why I lied. I walked inside through the backside door and tried to find people to talk to. I found nowhere to fit in, though. Fast forward. Though later in the night, people naturally started performing the main handshaking lineup, and I was a part of that. The kid in front of me was about to handshake, and thank to people who were throwing the party. I guess I did that handshake, said thank you, and on my way out, there was already a hand waiting for me. I assumed it was the kid behind me in line. I pretty much locked my hand in place, then at the last second turned it into a slap and said, sorry, I had to run. The last thing I saw was whoever it was going for the handshake, clutching his hand into a fist. I left the house and ran down the sidewalk. Wasn't because I was afraid of the person I refused the handshake. It was because I only then realized that that person probably just saw me leave the bathroom with boiled skin, fresh face back at the last party I was at. I just wanted to get away from there before I'm revealed some kind of weirdo. That's when I heard a voice yelling, hey, I kept running. I was being followed. I ran until I reached the side street that I parked Ricky's car on. I was relieved to get back home, but that was the night of me almost being caught doing something weird. If I hadn't been in that bathroom, I would have slowly wrapped up the night and just gone home. The actual drive was a lot of fun, with the windows down and the music blasting,